Yo creo que llegamos en un momento donde Colombia salía de una época muy oscura de su historia y casi sin saberlo pudimos generar un espacio de conversación colectiva, que es lo que hizo que el festival tuviera tanto éxito.
Ese festival nos permitió entrar en conversación a los escritores y eso es un fenómeno maravilloso.
No me imaginé que llegaríamos a los 20 años, debo confesarlo.
Me trajo la oportunidad de hablar de mí misma y de toda la comunidad LGBTIQ+, con otras palabras.
Si el Hey Festival no hubiera existido durante estos 20 años, muchos de nosotros seríamos muy distintos. Nos ha enriquecido de la mejor manera posible.
Cuando nos desafinamos, no escuchamos bien las armonías y no podemos escuchar al otro, que es lo peor. Estos festivales son muy importantes porque podemos escuchar al otro.
It's the jewel in the crown of the Hay Festival in terms of its international presence.
And that's what we do. We tell stories and we try and bring the world together.
Para Sura, la cultura es un encuentro. Un encuentro de ideas diversas, identidades y expresiones. Un encuentro entre la historia y el presente que evoluciona. Entre la memoria y los nuevos imaginarios. Encuentros que nacen cuando las letras crean historias que te cautivan. Cuando un festival despierta tus ideas. Cuando la música convoca tus emociones. Y cuando el arte encuentra quien lo disfrute. Vive la cultura.
Dame un momento y te regalo un verso. Un beso que te transporte a mi universo, donde nademos cada lluvia y bailemos cada trueno. Respirar a todo pulmón en sincronización, en un mismo latido, al mismo tambor. Pum, pum, las penas del corazón. Invierte en tu pasión. ¿Cuál es el sueño que no te deja dormir? Sí, esto que te impulsa, esto que te mueve, también nos impulsa, inspira y conmueve.
Cuidemos nuestros ríos como si fueran nuestros hijos.
Recordando lo puro de la inocencia de un niño. Volvamos a atrapar los peces con las manos. Creciendo flores, melodías en los dedos. Atrapando de cada árbol la carne madura de guayaba, guanábana, caña y cacao. Y así oler a la más dulce fragancia, canela, candela, flamea.
Celebremos los paisajes y el aire que respiramos en la misma frecuencia.
Honrémoslos.
Eso también es nuestra herencia.
Viajes astrales a otros lugares y otros tiempos. Hombres colibríes al vuelo, cantando juntos goles sin distingo de colores. Escucha. ¿Cuáles son las historias que te llegan al alma? Boom, boom, flash. La pelota en el charco, nuestro futuro campeón jugando.
El aroma del café que nunca falta en la mañana.
Y así no puedas ver la red, la sientes en la guitarra. Campesinas que confían en la tierra.
Y estudiantes que progresan con el libro.
Somos héroes sin medallas de cotidianas batallas, haciendo la diferencia. No importa dónde vayas. Las estrellas y aldeas de luciérnagas nos revelan otra forma de ver la oscuridad.
Creyendo en las personas y nuestras ganas de avanzar.
Creer es crear.
Toma mi mano, lo sientes, se agita.
Cuando empezamos a soñar.
Ready? Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome here to Hay today. It's wonderful to be here again in this extraordinary opera house, and I'm thrilled to be with my guest. As many of you probably know, we did an exercise to celebrate our 20th anniversary of being here in Colombia, here in Cartagena, and we asked all our audiences and people who subscribe to Hey to what did they think were the most important questions of our time. And we came up with 20 out of a huge amount that was sent in. Well over 700 arrived, and they were sifted through, and we came up with 20 of them. And over the course of this weekend, we're looking at them in batches of 3 or whatever, how it works. And today, we're going to look at 3 that connect to the environment. And the questions we're going to talk about are, how can we change the existing narratives around climate change? How can we make the exploitation of raw materials compatible with climate impact? And how can extensive farming be made compatible with protecting biodiversity worldwide, but particularly here in Colombia? So I'm thrilled that we are joined here by our 3 guests. First of all, Gustavo Ulcué Campo is from the indigenous Nauza tribes, and he holds a degree in education and communication. He's worked at regional and national levels in Colombia, advocating for the territorial rights of indigenous people who are being threatened by mining and industrial farming. No prizes for guessing which question he's going to start on. Our second guest, Virginia Mendoza, comes from Aragon in Spain. She's a long-published author of many environmental and wonderful books about the community and the environment. And her latest book, which is very ambitious, is called The Thirst, which is an exhaustive analysis of water and the part it's played both in culture, religion, in the popular mind, and of course, coming up to today, it's our most important resource. So she'll be tackling question number 2. But for question number 1, I'm going to start with our guest right at the other end of the line, the amazing Peter Frankopan, who's come here from Britain. He's the Professor of Global History at Oxford, and in fact, I think at Cambridge at the same time somehow. And he's written an astonishing trilogy of books, which are really the history of the Earth, the Silk Roads, the New Silk Roads, and his newest book, The Earth Transformed, which looks at how climate change has, over the millennia, has actually created what has happened in the world. But of course, when you get to the last part of his book, he starts writing about the acceleration that we're living in now and the consequences that we might all face. So Peter, the first question, how can we change the narrative around what's probably the most critical issue of our time?
Thank you, Rosie, and buenos días todos. Es un gran placer venir con...
Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure to speak to you here for the first time in Cartagena, Colombia. I will be speaking in English because I believe it will be better for both of us.
How do you change the narrative? I can give you a very boring answer, which is education. And I'd give 2 examples of why that's the case. First, narratives always change. They change because history is always political. The famous line that history is written by the winners is of course right. That's one reason why indigenous peoples who are pastoralists, who are nomadic, who have different life ways, have had their histories ignored, not just for decades or centuries, but for millennia. And when we talk about civilization, what we mean is people who live in cities. And those narratives mean that the ways we think about history are written always by people in cities, and almost always, until the last 50 years, almost always by men. So it's not surprising that the traditional way we think about the past is locked into the same stories, but that can change. So we can change how we think about the global center of power. We can change how we think about the importance of cultures in Asia, China, South Asia, the Middle East. We can change how we think about the dignity of women, of people from different religious beliefs, but you start with education. And so the first answer is, why do we need to change the narrative? It's very simple. We don't teach any children in a history lesson about the environment. The environment you learn in a geography lesson. We don't teach children at school how to grow food. We don't teach them how to purify water. We don't teach them how to understand soil chemistry. We teach them about great leaders. We teach them about Simon Bolivar. We teach them about Hitler. We teach them about persecution, about war. And that was fine. Well, maybe it wasn't fine, but this is the history of the past. So today's world, we need to engage in thinking about education in a different way. And that's not just about the climate and the natural world, but about everything. I mean, I'm very lucky. We have 4 lovely children. They learn the same things in school that I did. They learn how to do multiplication the same way. They learn how to do fractions and geometry in ways that, the education feels like it's 150 years too old. So I'll give you one example of how important those narratives are. I've worked on this subject for quite a while now, and I'm interested not just to say, I think you should change education. I always want to measure. I always want to check that things that sound right are correct. So there's a survey done in schools in the United States about 5 years ago about children of people who don't believe that climate change is important or is happening. Typically, those tend to be Republican voters, but not only. And there are lots of different reasons for that. It's about empirical exercise. Most of the people who don't believe in the importance of climate change or significance of biodiversity loss, etc., mostly tend to be men. That's not my view, that's a measurable fact. The single most important and effective way to change discussions about climate change, sustainability, respect for the environment, obvious things. You don't have to be thinking about the apocalypse, how to make your environment around you clean, how to make sure you don't waste resources. These aren't just about wanting to go and hug trees. The single most effective way was to teach young women, daughters of climate deniers or people who don't believe the importance of the environment, change their father's opinions. They don't need to change their mother's opinions, by and large, from what we can tell. And funnily enough, when you educate young boys about environment and climate change, it doesn't make any difference. I don't know why that is, but this big study had lots of data points. So how you educate people, what you teach them, how you explain that climate change, global warming, sustainability, food waste, soil chemistry are not luxuries. This isn't a political perspective. Across any of who you vote for in the ballot box, it's completely independent. But these are facts that we should learn and we should teach better. If you do that, you can start to change the way in which you educate people. You can start to make them more respectful. And we have done that by making young people more respectful of women. Not completely, but we've done better than we did a generation before. We are better at understanding the importance, not just of the dignities of indigenous peoples, but the importance of their histories in relation to our own histories. We've done quite well. We've got a long, long way to go, but it's a sign that if you do think about education, narratives change. And there are I'll give a final comment, there are lots of ways that happens, but probably the most important way is to help teachers, and to help teachers of young children in primary school, secondary school. This is not something you should learn when you're 20, 25, 35, 45. You start in the classroom. And when you sit with young children, anybody who has children, nephews and nieces, grandchildren, comes into contact, you'll see how keen they are to learn and understand, and how respectful they learn to be very early in their lives. So we should foster that. But for all sorts of reasons, we don't. But it is possible to change the narratives, and I can prove that because I wouldn't be here in Cartagena and had an invitation if I hadn't written a book that my publisher thought no one would buy a copy of. I wrote a book called, in Mexico and Central America, it's called Las Rutas de la Seda. Here it's called Corazón del Mundo. Makes it look like I wrote 2 books, but they're the same. Please buy both. But because you can change the narrative if you are dispassionate, objective, if you can engage with readers, then it's possible to change the way that you think.
Thank you very much, Peter. Gustavo, how do you help people understand what is going on with the tribal lands and the indigenous communities? Picking up on Peter's point about we need to know more.
Muchas gracias. Un saludo a todos.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. The indigenous peoples of Colombia, for those of us that are not very acquainted with our peoples, there are about 15 different indigenous peoples, without counting the uncontacted peoples present in Colombia. We believe there are about 5 of said non-contacted people, including the Yuri, but there are others as well. Colombia's geography is divided into 800 and some indigenous safeguards, covering 31% of Colombia's territory. 114 million hectares is the total number of hectares that Colombia has. So out of these 35 million hectares, 85% of this land is dedicated to conservation, safeguarding, because it's the páramos, the jungles, and the deserts. Just 15% of these formal lands that belong to indigenous peoples in Colombia are dedicated to agricultural production. So perhaps we have a great deal of land in total, but very little land that is dedicated to agricultural activities and managed by indigenous peoples. Here I'm referring to formal territory, in other words, land with land title. We call it an indigenous safeguard. But there are more than 14 million hectares that are currently managed by indigenous peoples, but they do not have land titles yet. And this land is similar as far as its makeup. Most of these indigenous lands are managed by inhabiting this territory in harmony with nature. Each people has its own standards and customs. In the case of the Nasa, that live in the southwest of Colombia, have a series of standards and norms to live in harmony with nature. And it all revolves around the cyclic nature of nature. And something that has brought us to the situation we're in today is that the balance of these cycles has been broken. For many indigenous peoples, agriculture is not based on permanent agricultural production on the same plot of land for decades. Instead, it's a circular system. So I grow crops here for X period of time, then I allow this land to rest for 10, 15, 20 years, and I grow crops somewhere else in order for the original plot of land to recover its nutrients. And this is the way many indigenous peoples have operated, or there is circular agriculture, or it's also linked to the moon. We have always done lunar-based agriculture, and this has been lost when the cycles were lost, because they knew when were the correct harvesting times or the right times to sow new crops, because it was all based on lunar cycles. And this harmony and balance is now under threat. So we have been looking for changes. Recently, COP16 was held in Colombia, and the indigenous peoples were suggesting the conservation areas within the global biodiversity framework. As you know, the GBF established 23 targets. Out of these, in the case of the indigenous peoples, we focus on target 3 that has to do with protection and conservation areas. And we are looking to ensure that the indigenous territories being recognized as areas for protection or protected areas. And number 2, that the areas managed by indigenous peoples be seen as territorial areas for land management, working in harmony with nature. Over many years, we have demonstrated that we can live with and preserve nature. And preserving nature doesn't mean an absence of humans, but rather how we can co-inhabit this land. If we cannot live in harmony with nature, then it will be very difficult for this territory to be in harmony at large. And this is why we have seen the situations that we've all seen. So we contribute to Target 3 by creating mechanisms and indicators to follow up on and protect biodiversity. This means that we need to have a healthy relationship with nature, and that we need to control nature adequately, and we need to be environmental authorities, for example. This is a proposal made not only in Colombia, but in many indigenous peoples throughout the world. Fortunately, at COP16, indigenous peoples were recognized in the role they play toward achieving Target 3. We hope that we will be able to continue advancing and agreeing on these indicators and further consolidate them. We're looking for ways to contribute to the world because we are contributing a great deal, not just oxygen, but also all of our ancestral knowledge and the system and heritage of our indigenous peoples is part of what humanity is needing. And we believe that this is a key to safeguarding and protecting nature and to ensure that it can be sustained over time and the planet can be sustained over time. As Peter said, oftentimes the narrative we hear is that indigenous peoples are landowners because we are under 3 million people in Colombia, but we possess 31% of Colombia's land area. So if we use this narrative logic, you'd say, well, they are landowners. But the truth is that most of this land is located in the forests, páramos, jungles, and the majority of the protected areas of Colombia, together with the national parks of Colombia and community councils and other areas of conservation. This is what allows us to prevent the climate crisis.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic answer. There's lots to pick up on, but we'll come back to it in a minute. And now I want to turn to you to talk about water and to talk about resources in the world, of which water is, well, oxygen may be the most important, but you could say water was also the most important. And how do you see us coping with the scarcity of water, especially how the planet's changing and different cloud patterns and... Sorry, okay. Water is such a scarce resource on the planet. And how do you see us using water properly in the future? Because many wars are going to be caused by lack of water, people building dams in the wrong places. I know that's something you've written about. There are lots of dams in South America that cause great problems further downriver. So would you talk to us about water for a bit?
Buenos días.
Good morning, almost afternoon now, and thank you very much to the Hay Festival for inviting me.
Thank you, Peter, for the company. Gracias también, Gustavo, por la compañía.
And also Gustavo. And thank you all for joining us. So what can I say about water? Well, I think in very general terms, I'll first focus on the value of water and perhaps the parts that are perhaps important to emphasize on, as Peter and also Gustavo has mentioned. I'd like to mention just a very brief anecdote that happened in one of my sessions. I was joined by a Waju indigenous woman. I love her peoples, and it was quite sad to actually learn about the work and the customs of these women that live in La Guajira in Colombia and that literally spend many hours during the day seeking water. Literally, they go with their donkeys, and it's very much connected to what they dream and their ancestors. And I was yesterday accompanied by Mrs. Palma, a Waju woman, and I wanted, or she was also very interested in me hearing to talk about this topic, and she actually told us something very interesting. And she said that after hours of seeking water, the first drops of water are actually given to the donkeys that accompany them. And the donkey is actually protected in the shelter, and then the following drops are for the tree that provides the shadow for the donkey. That's beautiful, and I think that we have a lot to learn. And this reivindication, if you will, of the indigenous wisdom is very much related to what Gustavo has just mentioned. And on the other hand, of course, learning about, well, practices in these places that are perhaps not so visible, right? And how deeply connected they are with nature. I wanted to highlight this because many times water consumption is sort of like an iceberg. We just open up the tap and we don't really think about the whole process, but consumption of water implies many things. For example, we have these water bottles. You know, everything that we have around us has needed water to be produced. For example, the ACs that are on in this theater are thankfully working, of course, due to hydroelectrical energy creation. So I do believe that it's quite important for us to be much more aware of this invisible right, consumption that I think is not so much visible. For example, the water needed for us to be able to use artificial intelligence. So this is definitely a tool that opens up a whole Pandora of possibilities, but I do believe that we need to be much more critical. And, of course, I mean, it's not about us obsessively asking ourselves how much water are we consuming in everything we do, because, of course, that would be, I think, very tiring. But everything we are surrounded by has had water consumption for it to be produced. I mean, I think the question that I ponder upon is, why do we call water a resource? I think we need to recover perhaps the sacred trait of water that I think indigenous peoples do acknowledge. Yesterday, for example, this Waju woman told us that rain actually is something masculine because rain is the father and the earth is the mother. But to them, water, the water drops of rain, are a masculine trait. They represent the father, and I thought it was a beautiful way to see it. And at the same time, I deem it important for us to listen to the stories that are coming from rural areas in relation to water, to time. I come from La Mancha, Spain. This is, of course, the land of El Quijote. And in El Quijote, only 2 times it rains. And we're very much used to, well, water scarcity. And sometimes when I see or I feel this relation with water, I think it has to do, on the one side, due to this disconnection in cities, right? Because we just open up the water tap and we don't really sit and reflect. Where is this coming from? This literally represents the displacement of millions of people around the world that have literally been forcibly displaced of their peoples, towns, and lands of origin because they've been displaced, for example, for the building of a dam, which is actually a topic that I talk about, and actually what inspired me to write the book La Sed. So not only do we need to ponder about this invisible consumption, but also about the people that have had to actually make sacrifices for us to have this so-and-so called resource. So I think that we need to grant water the meaning that it actually deserves. And I think for us to find those answers, we need to go back to rural areas. And I think it's been, general culture, popular culture, and idioms are, I think, perhaps not taken seriously. And it's quite curious because there's a bunch of mythological idioms that have a certain pattern. For example, the day of this saint, because it's that day of the year. And if an animal does X or Y, Z thing, the next day it'll rain, or it'll be drier, or it'll be warmer or colder. I think we need to really recover and appreciate all this knowledge, because not only is that part of, let's say, this great archive of popular knowledge. For example, my grandparents surely knew when it was going to rain, depending on what birds did. We had a neighbor, and she read the behavior of wasps, and literally by observing wasps, this neighbor knew when it was going to rain, and people thought he was crazy, but it was quite proven. The people that observe that are quite renowned. There are Nobel Award winners that are very much aware of this. There's actually an idiom, I don't know if you use it in Colombia, but in Spain there's about 40 ways to say this. And, well, there are many, many idioms. I think that this has scientific basis up to now, so it's very important for us to, I think, recover this popular wisdom of our peoples, because it's as useful, to be able to really understand what are we facing, environmentally speaking.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Very keen to come back to you in a way, picking up from what you said about education, which I'm sure everyone agrees about, but I would ask you, have we got time to say we have to put this all through, a younger generation? And thinking of what was just said about dams, China is putting dams right up in Tibet now to divert water, and don't we need more? Apart from just how we talk about it, don't we need more action as well?
Yes, but it's not new. So 5,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, which was one of the cradles of civilization, where the first big groups of people lived together in what became cities. 5,000 years ago, there was a war over water and water rights between 2 cities that lasted for 150 years. So the question about resource, about protection, particularly of water, is one that is a human story. And of course, when there are more people and we live closer to each other, lots of things that are great happen. We can all gather in Cartagena for a festival, but it puts pressure on resources. So the very first case brought to the United Nations for dispute after it was formed in 1945 was about water rights for the Indus River between India and Pakistan following Indian independence. You mentioned, Rosie, China building dams that can control the great water tower of the Qingdao-Tibet Plateau, which is one of the greatest natural water resources on Earth. But I think most people don't know about water. So we look outside here into the Caribbean Sea. It's beautiful. We're in a planet filled with water. But for every 10,000 drops of water on this planet, only one is fresh water. So today, in 2025, in February, 1st of February, 50% of the world's population this year will go through what the United Nations calls extreme water shortage. 3.5 billion people, mais o menos, this coming year. So we don't necessarily see it at a festival in Cartagena. We don't think about, as Virginia says, where water comes from. But that level of consumption has been epic. It's been so great that water taken out of the plains of northern India, one of the most inhabited, populous places on Earth, over the last 10 years has meant that the position of the North and the South Pole has moved, right? And that's something which should make you think, okay, that's a big change, but that should also make you scared if you take an airplane or use GPS, because we're dependent on very accurate figures to be able to geolocate lots of things. So it's not just about the changing world around us and should we be worried. It changes things that we take for granted. So yeah, I think that the world we live in is one where in Central Asia, we think most of the glaciers will have melted by 2050. That affects a major population group. One of the great hotspots already, people don't write about in the press as much as they should do. The greatest war region on Earth today is not in the Middle East or in Ukraine, both filled with horror and terror, but in the belt between the Democratic Republic of Congo through South Sudan and into Eritrea. Last year, 500,000 people killed. Almost no mention in the newspapers anywhere here in Colombia that I could find. And lots of this will accelerate when we see the damming of the Nile, a source of huge tension between Ethiopia and Egypt. But those fights for battles for water and for resources are hugely important through history. And we shouldn't be stupid enough to think that our generation, or the one that follow us, or the ones that follow us, are immune because everyone has an iPhone, or because we can fly easily to one side of the world. We need to protect through regulation, through intervention, through governments at local, national, and global levels. And the real problem, I think all of us in this theatre know, is that you can legislate at local level in Chocó or Amazonas or in Bogotá or in Cartagena or for the NASA people. You can do it even for South America, but global systems, climate systems are global, like disease environments are global. We learned that. If I'd been sitting here 5 or 6 years ago, no one would have believed me or understood it, but climate and disease are the two primary global things to worry about. And this morning I woke up, as a new paper published this morning, so you're brand new, fresh, not yet in the newspapers, but in the most important journal on infectious disease, identifying a discovery of Hendra in Alabama. Hendra has a mortality rate of about 70%. And these things happen when the world around us changes. So do we have time? The right answer is that time was past. We should have realized, like driving on a motorway, we should have seen the red lights of the cars stopped in front of us a long time ago. Now we're having to react at great speed. And the only way which we can do that, in my opinion, is through investment in the sciences, innovation and technology to try to help us with some of these things. And I don't just mean science and technology of people in laboratories in universities. I mean science and technology of all kinds, indigenous likewise, because biodiversity protection, as everybody in this theatre should know, have the highest levels of protection in nomadic, pastoralist and indigenous peoples. That's the same, not just here in Colombia, the same in Central Asia where I spend a lot of my time working. But those lights, it's not flashing orange anymore, it's red. So some of my colleagues at Cambridge are not working anymore how to slow down global warming, how to slow down water consumption. They're working on how to reverse it because we're past the stop sign already. So there are reasons to be hopeful. And I was talking to Rosie, the chair, before we went on, saying, ideally, because it's a beautiful day, people don't leave Cartagena and kill themselves. We need to be optimistic and we need to be practical, but we should be very aware that the world we live in is not going to become dangerous. It already is.
Well, that's a very... Gustavo, I know that a lot of Colombia is threatened by people wanting to keep mining and extracting from the soil. I mean, how much does that affect you and your lands?
Well, the economy based on consumption and extraction has been increasing in Colombia. We have increasingly found that the borders of the forests, its limits, have been pushed forward. I'll give you an example from the Department of Meta and another example from the Department of Guaviare. In the case of Meta, with the Sicuani people in Puerto Nariño, in Puerto Gaitán, there's a situation there with the Sicuani people. And it's that the Mennonites, that has been expanding its borders and is increasingly present in Colombia, which is a European religion and religious group that has been pushing forward its frontier to produce food for the pork industry. And this had led to them demanding more and more land. And they are increasingly putting down forests to be able to have more land for crops and livestock. And economies such as this one go against the cycles of life. And this has an impact not only on indigenous peoples, and in this case the Sicuani people, that are currently experiencing a very difficult time. It's very difficult for these people to be able to survive if they are not given what they need. Their life cycle lasts about 80 years in the sense that they live in one location for about 6-7 years and then they relocate to another area. And by the time they go back to the initial area, it's been about 30 or 40 years. So what's happened is that when these indigenous peoples return to that land that they left 40 years back, they find that there are soy crops, for example, or sorghum crops, and this has had an impact on their territorial land. Mining has also had a significant impact. Extractive economies have had a tremendous impact on indigenous lands. We have made efforts to protect these areas. In Colombia, something curious happened a few years back, and it's that in Colombia, there is a legal figure which is national parks and another one for safeguards, indigenous safeguards, to be able to protect the land between the Amazon and Guaviare, that is called Apavoris. This sacred region for indigenous peoples, they had to create both a national park and a indigenous safeguard, both of them. They had to create both a national park and safeguard in order to provide as much legal certainty as possible to the territory. And Anglo Gold filed a lawsuit against the state because they had plans to mine there, and there was already a mining license granted, but because it's a natural park, mining could not be allowed. So Anglo Gold filed a lawsuit because of the prohibition of mining in this region. And this is something that has occurred in various parts of Colombia. Not only has natural resources or nature been exploited, but for mining purposes or to extract coal, but illegal economies have also been undermining our lands and leading to a lack of harmony. For my people, coca plants and leaves are sacred, but these crops have been used for other uses, not the ones traditionally used in our peoples, and these illegal economies have broken the harmony of our people. So extractive economies are increasing, hydrocarbons in Putumayo, and other regions. Recently, the government of Colombia lost a demand with the Uya people before the Latin American Human Rights Court because this people had been negatively affected by the oil companies that impacted the life cycle of the Uwa people in the Department of Meta and other departments. So the oil activities, and this took 20 years, this entire legal process, and recently the Inter-American Court had a final ruling in favor of the indigenous people because this extractive activity in indigenous territory should not be allowed. Of course, not everything can be resolved legally or in court. Many situations do not advance in this way, and of course, illegal armed groups also impact our lands. But it's important for us to reconsider our consumption patterns and habits. This consumption is what leads us to wanting to have more. And then this, of course, has an impact on nature. So this is not just occurring in indigenous peoples. There are also community councils and areas for conservation that are under threat because there are an increase in extractive activities, not only monocultures, but also illegal crops. These are all having a negative impact on Colombia.
Thank you. That puts so many things in perspective about how it comes right down to the small level where you can't protect a field, and the fact that you, as indigenous people, knew how to recycle back and let land recover and then come back again and farm it is so different from what the industrial farming does, which says the land has to produce. And you have amazing stats in your book, Peter, about how much amount of topsoil is lost every year across the world. What is it, some trillions of topsoil is lost because of bad farming? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a survey done, a huge survey using on 20 million people in China. So that's a lot to work out about whether you can increase the yields while maintaining the fertilizer use, or if you can increase the yields while reducing fertilizer use. Here in Colombia, you use about 130% of the fertilizer that you should use, right? So it's unnecessary. This study in China shows that if you educate farmers and you support them, you can get better yields and use less fertilizer. Yeah. So it's a win, but it always comes back to education. It's how do you best learn from what you do? You know, all of us are part of the problem of changing consumption patterns, and particularly dependence on meat. But 99% of deforestation globally is to do with agriculture expansion, right? Well, 99% of it, and a lot of the things that Gustavo spoke about, from mining, here in Colombia too, with the production of cocaine, the toxins that are produced into waterways, into the land, are absolutely catastrophic. So there are all sorts of ways in which working out how to handle better strategies can be done while maintaining economic growth, agricultural growth, but it requires more thought, that's all. And it doesn't seem to me that difficult to try to do that. So some of these big studies can be replicated around the world and should be replicated. Here in Cartagena, amongst the things, shows what breakfast I had. Here in Cartagena, this beautiful city, your PM 2.5, the toxic microplastics and particulates you have in the air are 3 times higher than the World Health Organization. Right, so measurably, when you breathe the air in Cartagena, and it's better here, by the way, than back home in Oxford, so I'm winning by being here, it affects your life expectancy. And all of us realize that we want to live a long, healthy, happy life. If you degrade the environment, just because you can't see it, when you eat a carrot or you eat some beef, you don't know where it's come from. Some of it is about explaining to people what it is that they need to do. So I suspect everybody in this theatre wouldn't be here if they didn't share these views anyway. But it's not necessary that it has to just be the failure of capitalism or the failure of business that always exploits. There are ways of doing this sustainably that are perfectly fine. But as you said right at the beginning, Rosie, like I've said in my book, our challenge today is the accelerations of new technology, energy demands, water shortages, and so on are absolutely vast. Here in Colombia, it's by far the biggest palm oil producer in the Western Hemisphere. And those kinds of things, anybody who washes their hair or applies lipstick, eats ice cream, has these ingredients. If you don't teach kids or grown-ups that, then you can't make good choices.
So Virginia, can I come to you before we come to the audience? A lot of the stuff we've talked about is to do with a culture of extractive stuff, and that we produce more and more, and you picked up a water bottle, and I know from having actually read Peter's book, but I think I've read elsewhere before, that we have 500 billion plastic bottles a year for water or for Coke or whatever, and that actually equates to 60 for every single citizen on the planet, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. And that is not just the water that we're putting in a bottle when we could get it from a tap, that's also the plastic and then the microplastic. So the culture of increasing amounts of stuff. I mean, something that fascinates me about energy and about the green energy revolution is that, in fact, it isn't making us change to green energy. What is happening is we're actually just using more energy, and that every year we use more, and therefore we make more. And that something has to stop the desire for more, of whatever the more happens to be, before we get back to the kind of cycle that Gustavo is prepared to have, which says, I can leave this field alone for 80 years, to give it time to get back together. And we don't allow that anymore in our system. And water is hugely important to that. I mean, Peter was saying about beef and about whatever it is, water is always there, isn't it?
Sí, bueno. Perdón.
Yes, I'm sorry. There's a slight delay. Well, an example that I believe was quite extreme from where I come from, there is the oldest well that has been found in the Iberian Peninsula that comes from the Motilla community that existed in the Bronze Age in La Mancha. There was a tremendous drought a few years back, one of the worst that has been experienced in humanity. And some societies, not only because of the drought, but other reasons, that ended, civilizations that ended, although I don't really like to refer to a collapse, because sometimes a collapse involves migrating or the end of a kingdom. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone dies the way it might seem in a history book. But this extreme context, in any case, in La Mancha, led to someone discovering that there was land underground. And people began to build the motillas, which is why they're called the motillas culture, because they are a fortified well surrounding the villages and settlements. There were places to store grain, as well as places for the elite to find protection underground as well. So this was a place to be able to access water when other people's were collapsing, and they were there for quite some time. And today, this well is completely dry, and it's harrowing to see it. Why is it dry? It's right next to the Tablas Natural Park, which is one of the key locations for the water network in Spain. So it's a serious problem we have in the place that I come from. I also come from a place where hundreds of years back, our forefathers found in the olive tree an opportunity for living in an arid area, because olive trees can deal with drought quite well. So this has also been the foundation for our food customs and dishes. There are now extensive olive groves that don't require a great deal of water. but we're speaking of water theft of incredible proportions, which means that not only are the water reserves running out, but they are also making olives depend on water resources, which wasn't the case in the past. So this unnecessary extreme demand for water ends up impacting all levels of society. And it has repercussions on us as well, because this is an area that we almost had to leave in a moment of extreme drought. When I was born that year, the neighboring villages discovered there was not just drought, but there was someone who was taking everyone's water, stealing everyone's water, and everyone stood up against him. And they knocked down his electric post because they discovered that he had a very modern irrigation system at that point in time, connected to very deep wells. And they knocked them over so that he wouldn't have electricity for its operation. This is how they had our village access water once again. So oftentimes, this problem that we face is that perhaps individually we might say, well, I, as a person who has experienced certain limitations of just having access to half an hour of water per day, I'm very careful when it comes to my personal water consumption. If it's a time of drought, I have one of these like toy inflatable pools, and I don't fill it up. I don't need them to tell me not to fill it up to not do so. But of course, this doesn't just depend on citizens, because that would make it sound as though we're always the ones responsible. This inflatable pool that I haven't been filling it up, what I do is reserve it for a big company that's going to now relocate to my region. That perhaps will mean us not having water in a few years. It's a company that we all know of and that we have probably all bought products from. And the plan in very little time is for their energy consumption to be equivalent to that of our entire community, all those who live in Aragon, and water consumption might be 5 times the current amount.
That's pretty terrifying as a story. Please start thinking of questions. I'm just going to ask Peter one last question, which is just really about energy consumption and the endless desire for more stuff. I mean, what do we do about that? I mean, you think of Amazon piles and hoarding and just the Shine, that Chinese clothing company, they produce 1,200,000 different designs in a year, not just clothing. They produce that many designs so that you can literally wear a garment for an hour and throw it away. How do you start to curb that?
Do you want good news or bad news?
Whichever you, can we have both?
I'll give you the good news is, thanks to education, particularly of women, and thanks to interventions and investment in medicine and medical care, particularly in childbirth, women now don't die when they have children, and life expectancy is much longer, particularly for women, because women get educated properly, which, you know, even in England 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, women were allowed to turn up to the lectures at my university. We weren't allowed to do they were allowed to do the exams, but they wouldn't get classed and alongside the men. No one is going to say that we have gender equality, particularly with income, but things have got better. But one of the functions is that in almost every single part of the world, because women get married older, they're in control of their reproductive health, global populations are falling, and in some cases they're falling extremely quickly. In every single country in Europe, for example, East Asia, some are worried about the population loss, in fact. China's population, we expect, is going to be less than half of what it is by the end of this century. So it could be that, you know, the moment that we're living in today has the highest global population. Some experts think it's got a little bit further to go, as they think with oil and fossil fuels it's got a bit further to go, but we can see the top of the hill, and then when we get over the top, things might get better reasonably quickly. I mean, if you're a historian, never bet on peace and happiness. Always bet on revolution, migration, disaster. That's what people write about, and that's how you write bestsellers. You write about disasters, which I'm not really that interested in. I would like to live a nice, long, happy life. So it could be that our consumption patterns will naturally fall because there will be fewer of us. Optimizations, you know, for example, The latest tractors being produced in the United States have 36 cameras attached to them. They're able to distinguish between weeds and crops in a fraction of a second. And those efficiencies are incredibly helpful, powerful, and useful. We can use what we have better. So, there is some good news. The bad news is, how do you encourage people not to make short-term, stupid decisions? Good luck. I don't think it's easy. I think that you can teach people at home. You start with your family, you start with your friends. But it's not easy to change people's spending patterns, living patterns, and also people don't want to be told what they should and shouldn't do. Legislation and prevention are tricky. But I think that all of us realize that things are more dangerous in the world of today than we did maybe 10 years ago. Today we realize we're living through a climate revolution, a reorganization, different implications in different parts of the world. Of course, the rich countries better able to cope, but fires in Los Angeles announced this morning that they're finally under control. Do make people sit up and think that there are problems. And one of the reasons these fires were so bad in LA was because there'd been terrible drought until about 2 years ago, then one of the worst rain systems in Californian history. And that fed the vegetation to become unbelievably robust. And then when we had a new dry period that started at the beginning of last year, it meant that the perfect conditions where there was more vegetation than ever before that was dry that allowed these fires to become so dangerous. So the hydrological changes are key. Everybody realizes we're going through a climate revolution. We're going through a digital revolution. We're going through a workplace revolution. We're going through a geopolitical revolution. Not just because of elections in the White House, but no matter how you look at it, those things are changing. And getting everything right when you have warning lights with everything on an aeroplane, the engine one, the wings, the tail, the wheels, it's really difficult to make good decisions. And it means that the people we elect into office in democratic states, it's never been more important that they make the right decisions and that they are informed enough by experts, rather than just members of their political party, to make the best decisions possible for the long term. And I'd speak it with great respect coming from Europe, where we have very few obvious natural leaders who are doing a good job that understand some of these problems. I think it's one of the things we think about a lot at Oxford. How do we as a university try to encourage political leaders to learn about the best ways to solve inequality or soil chemistry? How do we educate politicians? So we have a program at the School of Government where we try to attract political leaders to take a week or two away from their country, come to study with us, to learn from the latest experts in different fields. And we find it very difficult to get people from Europe to come and join us. We have, for example, former President Duque of Colombia. Everybody has a political persuasion, but he spent a lot of time at the School of Government explaining his lessons and also listening to what it is that we can teach. And I think those kinds of examples of bringing in global leaders, helping them be better informed, doesn't mean they're going to make good decisions, but it means they're better informed when they make a good or a bad one.
That's so great to hear. Have we got some questions from the hall? We haven't got that long. There's a hand here. So if we can, there's a hand, yeah, that first, and then we'll come to down here next. Thank you.
Hello. I have a question about our current political situation in the United States, one of the largest polluters in the world, and now a president who's striking from websites, from official documents, from everything that's official, the words climate change. Still, Europe has had a lot of progress. You have Latin America having the conversations. Is it necessary to be completely alarmed, or do you trust that at the local level, we're still going to be able to have these conversations because it's so obvious that the change is happening? I mean, for somebody who works in climate, it's very, very devastating to see these things happening politically, but at the same time, there's been work done already. So how optimistic, pessimistic are you guys about the current political situation of the world?
Virginia, do you want to start? It's a good question for everyone to answer. And keep it fairly short, because we've...
Sí. Thank you for your question. I believe that
human beings have been at least a couple of times under extinction risk due to extreme climate events. And to a greater extent, thanks to our creativity, our capability to adapt, changes of diet, etc. I think what has made us thrive, and partly the reason why we're all sitting here, is because we were able to cooperate, to work together, and to have one sole cause as a common ground. But I would say that the baseline is that we should all join efforts. And it's very dangerous that very powerful people with very important and influential countries in the world literally want to delete words such as climate change from documents. I am quite an optimist, but I believe it's quite challenging. I really need to work. I need to work on my optimism on a day-to-day basis. I think we've always found the way to thrive, and we can always find it. Now, it's not, a nice post-optimism what I'm talking about. However, I do believe in the capability of human beings. However, sometimes I believe we're too focused on the short term, and we're quite extremist sometimes. And we push the brakes too fast, I think, sometimes. Luckily, I believe that has worked for more than once. Because I also believe that if we become hopeless, then we will not be able to actually take action. So I believe that we should remain a bit optimistic. I don't think the narrative is sufficient enough. Actions must also join narratives. There may be the denial, right, of climate change from many right now, but I believe we should need to take specific actions. Look, some years ago, Red Más was created, and this project was created to reduce global warming, and it was a proposal where carbon bonds were created to protect forests and to avoid logging, basically, offering a benefit to be paid. And that was, I think, benefited more companies. So companies that are actually polluting are paying more bonuses to be able to mitigate what they're creating. So not only do I oppose, let's say that I oppose to climate change. Well, if I oppose to climate change and I don't believe it, it's going to be even harder for me to actually take actions on it. During the COP16 we talked about, and we reflected, are REDD+ projects really working around the planet? Or, look, there's REDD+ projects focused on whales or other species that absorb carbon dioxide. And quite unfortunately, this shouldn't only be, narratives from the great leaders, but we should all reflect. Are these real solutions, or are these actually false solutions around climate change? I think we must be very aware of this. And of course, the narrative of the USA will perhaps be worse each year, but we must reflect how we can take actions and critically think if, for example, these projects such as REDD+ are working, and if these are the paths to take, or if we should consider other paths and perhaps not only think about renewable energies, because of course there's much debate about this. And as Peter said, I believe that we need to continue educating people. And more of all, we need to consume less and, not contribute so much to climate change.
Those are very good answers. I don't need to...
I think, have we got time for one more question? Okay, let's take one more question. The guy had his hand up first, over here.
Hola.
You talked about someone who stole the water in your town. I want to know a bit more about that story. Who was this man? And if this person was punished from a legal standpoint, because in Colombia there's a case that the river Rancheria was stolen from an indigenous community, and that hasn't been really solved, and literally it was stolen and given to mining companies and other industries. I don't want to extend, but I'm interested in, well, perhaps the good fortune or bad fortune that this man faced. And from a legal standpoint, I want to know what your opinion is on perhaps, punishment, so that perhaps people who want to steal water bodies, well, can actually think about it twice. So this man, I didn't really research much more on what ended up in his life, but I do know that, well, the community was benefited by justice because it was proven in trial that this aquifer was overexploited. So compensations were granted, and literally, well, he had to give the water back. He wasn't alone. Another person was also sentenced, and casually he also stole water from my people.
They're all extremely rich.
Exactly. Yeah, very rich. On that incredibly cheery note, I'd like to say thank you to all of you so much for being so wise and telling us so much. And I know that Peter's book and Virginia's books are out there, so please sign them. And can you also say thank you very much to our translators? Will you come on out?